and welcome to the latest episode of GAIN's Interview Cruncher. I'm Shuli Ghosh. I'm delighted to be hosting this session as part of GAIN's new series on climate change and nutrition, why they need each other. From plant growth to crop yields, it's clear that our food security is being challenged on multiple fronts. High temperatures, drought, flooding, they're all taking their toll. Today, we're going to be hearing from two of the world's leading scientists on how climate change threatens nutrition and food security, and try to answer some of the most pressing questions about the expected crisis. So how does climate change affect our ability to produce the food needed to feed a growing population? How does it impact on the nutritional value of food? And what does it mean for those people who are already struggling to eat a sufficient and healthy diet? We'll be drawing on the latest scientific evidence to lay out the most impactful actions we can take to respond to the changes which are coming, as well as reducing the emissions from our food systems. We've also got the COP27 climate conference coming up in November. So we'll be asking what actions and what commitments we need to see from governments around the world. What kind of solutions can be implemented? And we'll also be reflecting on GAIN's work to ask what we and other actors can do to respond to the growing threat of climate change. So let me introduce our speakers. Cynthia Rosenspike is a senior research scientist at the NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies. She leads the Climate Impacts Group investigating the interactions of climate on systems and sectors important to human well-being. And in 2022, she was awarded the World Food Prize for her work on climate impacts on the agricultural sector at both national and global level. We also have Mario Herrero, a professor of sustainable food systems and global change in the Department of Global Development at Cornell University. He's also a Cornell Atkinson Scholar and a Nancy and Peter Meinig Family Investigator in the life sciences. He has over 25 years of research and development experience, and he's a newly appointed GAIN board member. And we have with us Jessica Colston, the Environment Technical Lead for GAIN. Jessica works across GAIN's programs, partnerships and advocacy work to help realize GAIN's ambition to become a truly green NGO. How are these particularly changing in Africa and South Asia? These are some of the countries which are most widely affected by the impact of climate change. So what does that mean for food production there?
AgMIP works all over the world, and we're a network of over 1,000 food system researchers and modelers. And so we're just right now finishing a project, just recently have finished a project in Senegal, Ghana, and Zimbabwe. And what we're learning there is, first of all, there are teams there. We call them the AgMIP A teams, standing for adaptation teams, because Mario is absolutely right. It is not a silver bullet. It is really adaptation packages and policies. And so what AgMIP is doing now with the A teams in these countries, and now we're looking to expand both in Africa and elsewhere, is to help. It's working at two scales at once. This is one of the things that we have to do to deal with these droughts, heat waves, floods. As Mario also rightly pointed out, all of these extreme events can happen in one season. They can be concatenating onto each other. So we have to get a lot smarter. So what the AgMIP has now developed a coordinated national and the agricultural region within the country, because no country has enough funds. They have to prioritize, right? And so what AgMIP does is help the national stakeholders, decision makers, see what are the really the most effective adaptation packages that can then be used to scale up to get to as many regions as possible. So these kinds, and we take a development pathway approach because it's not only okay, it used to be we used to do the work. It's okay, we're planting earlier or later depending on the rainy season. Now it really is about what kind of development pathway does a country want to be on for their agricultural development, their food system development. And so what needs to be done to create a sustainable development pathway at the national level, and then what in the different regions with tailored interventions. And that's what we use the models for, because it's very helpful, because you don't have to do as many field trials, and field trials take a long time, season after season.
And it also
the models we can
governments
just
aren't
answer.
working in the dark. You're giving them
Right.
informed, allowing them to make informed decisions.
Exactly. And that's why I also share, because we work with so many researchers all around the world, I share Mario's optimism. I mean, it's serious optimism. It's significant. I mean, these challenges are highly significant, but because we're this approach to all work together it's really bearing fruit, and the national stakeholders are telling us, decisions are telling us, this is what we want these modeling results. We want to learn more about the models so that we can then ask, and they ask the questions what they would like us to do.
Okay, well, I mean, that's really encouraging. Let's talk about some of the challenges. Mario, sticking with those regions of South Asia and Africa, there's got to be some trade-offs, right, in addressing the needs of trying to mitigate climate change to keeping nutrition at a good level. You mentioned livestock. I mean, livestock is a notorious example of something that provides nutrition, but is also bad in the sense of emissions and impact on climate change. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, livestock are not always bad in terms of emissions. And I think that we are making good inroads into, first of all, understanding much better consumption patterns and what needs to be eaten and where. But also, where can we produce livestock at low opportunity costs for the environment? And I think that this is something critical that we need to do to be better at. For example, trying to produce livestock where there's really no competition with arable land becomes really important in many places. Using, for example, circularity as a way of providing feed from food waste, from crop byproducts, from a range of other substrates, to be able to produce livestock a little bit more decoupled from land. Let me give you an example about circularity. We know that if you were to use all the food waste of the world and put it through livestock production, you could actually produce around 23 grams of protein per person per day. And this is about 40% of an adult's requirements. Can you imagine? It's something that merits further investigation, because these are the kinds of things that really need to happen. In low and middle income countries, obviously the improvement of emissions intensities by increasing productivity still remains one of the most important ways of reducing the impacts of livestock. And if you couple this with reductions in animal numbers, so as to have more productive but less cows, then this actually creates environmental gains of all sorts. Land use. There's less problems of trying to find fodders, less water needed, less resources in general. So it will be a combination of demand management and also smarter farming. That will, together with regulations and incentives for farmers. In reality, we haven't tested enough mechanisms for promoting improved environmental stewardship through livestock systems. You know, if this makes it to the commercial sector, well, then we'll see even bigger gains.
Yeah, and I think we'll also talk a little bit more later on about the incentives needed for policy makers. I want to bring Jessica in at this point. Let's talk a bit about the role of organizations like GAIN. What is GAIN doing to respond to the threat of climate change on both nutrition and food security?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And I mean, it's been fascinating to listen to the discussion so far, and really underlined for me why GAIN has started this journey to look at the climate and to understand, you know, how our programs interact with it and what we should be doing. So there's two big things GAIN is really looking at. One is to take a look internally at what we do and say, how can we do this in a way that is more climate sensitive, both in terms of mitigation and making sure that everything GAIN does is consistent with a sort of low emission sustainable pathway. And then also to look at where we need to adapt and bring in those adaptation actions to ensure better nutrition in the future. And the other big area we look at is advocacy. So obviously there are many things that GAIN can't influence and control, but what can we go out for and tell the world about that really needs to happen for climate and nutrition? So, I mean, just to expand on the first one a bit, I think Mario already started to speak a bit about GAIN's focus and our work. We work in 13 different countries in Africa and South Asia, and it's all about trying to increase access to healthy, safe and nutritious foods. And lots of those things, as Mario was saying, about increasing the demand for certain foods, looking at the value chains, thinking about how you really get those foods from the farm to the consumer. So often it's not immediately obvious how that might relate with climate or how we make it more climate friendly. But I'll give you one example. We have a project in Pakistan, which is all about increasing the access to dairy for poor consumers, where that's really going to improve their nutrition. So we started that just as a nutrition program, just looking at that side of things. And then we realized that one of the dairy companies we were working with was finding there were 10,000 litres of whey produced in the cheese making process every single day. And what our project then did was to say, look, that's a nutritious product. Can we use that and turn that waste into something that reaches the consumer? And that's exactly what they did. They developed a nutritious drink that children can access in, you know, cheap single serving packets, so it's easy for consumers to afford. And that's a really good example, I think, of exactly what Mario was just touching on in that last point. You know, how do you do more with what we have and make the best use of those resources? So that's the kind of thing I spend my time looking at all of our programs, looking for those opportunities. And I think we'll discuss a bit more on some of the advocacy side later, but the second big part of my role is going out and thinking about, on the global stage, what needs to happen, looking ahead to events like COP27, thinking about that integrated policy making that Cynthia was touching on then, and what are the kind of packages and things that need to happen in different places.
Yeah, and I think that is so fascinating and such an important issue about reducing food wastage, as you've said, because this is one of the things that is going to make a huge difference, and we're really going to need to look at as we look at a changing world that we're living in. I mean, Cynthia, you touched on this. You know, we're not just having to deal with climate change. There are so many unexpected things coming up, these sort of cascading events, the pandemic that we're coming through, and people are predicting more pandemics in the future. And of course, the hugely disruptive conflict going on in Ukraine, and the pressure that has put on the world's food supplies. Is it possible to prepare for these kind of multiple crises which seem to be happening at the same time?
We have to, you know, but what is it like before detail? You have to have a plan. It doesn't work. It never works, but you've got to have a plan. And that's what research is all about. But I think clearly what we now need to do is create research teams. I really think it's all has to be transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary teams, and bring in these the multiple stresses and have protocols. So, you know, our big thing in AgMIP is protocols, because when you have protocols, then the studies can be replicated by others. So it's not just the individual team that gets the funding for that particular project, but then those protocols can be used, and when they're by other teams, and then the results can be compared. So we are learning across. And that leads me to, I think, something very important from the cascading shocks and stresses, is the transboundary aspects. So for a really, really, really a long time, the research has really just been very place-based. And of course, it has to be, right? Food systems are fundamentally right there on the ground, right, with the farmers. But at the same time, it has these telescoping scales. I talked before about the regions within the countries, the national, but then there's now a new area of research in adaptation science on transboundary research. And this is bringing in the regional and global supply chains. And I think for the stresses in particular, we see of just the conflict side with the Ukraine and the grain supplies, how we have to be considering the shocks and the effects on the transboundary issues as well. And this has to be a growing area of research as well.
Well, let's talk a bit more about research. And sorry, Mario,
has,
go ahead.
Mario has a comment.
Yeah, I would like to add to that, and the other thing that we must do, well, as you know, in climate change, we tend to use a range of scenarios, both for the climate change signals, but also scenarios of how we imagine of plausible futures for the world's different sectors. I think that our next set of scenarios needs to explore more broadly issues related to extreme events and put actually more extreme notions of how the world might evolve. I think it's really important because, we can use those types of exercises to improve our preparedness. It's really, really important to improve the way we could handle these things in the future and already start thinking of what are the potential investment needs that we are going to need. Financing is one of the things that, has been pathetically slow in climate change. And look, if there's a lesson from the COVID pandemic, is that, look, in 3 months, I think the first 3 months, like 40 billion were raised to actually throw in to develop vaccines that were developed in a year. This is absolutely unprecedented.
That's because it suddenly became a huge priority for governments. Health and infection became a massive priority. So how do you get policymakers to say, right, this is our priority? And we've seen various climate conferences where promises are made and then the money doesn't follow. Mario, how do we get governments to actually follow through on their promises?
Yeah, the key thing of a COVID pandemic is that it personalized the issue, because it's about life or death. It's about a human response. And with climate change, until very recently, it was seen as, well, the environment, a global good. It's not a personal kind of thing. But now that we are really starting to start feeling the heat, as a pun intended, people are really going to start throwing big money at this. It's definitely what I foresee. We cannot keep having the kinds of heat waves and the human losses, etc., that we are starting to have.
Do you agree?
It's late, but it will lead to time.
As Cynthia pointed out, we've got these global promises. 2030, apparently, that's the deadline. Cynthia, do you see that happening? I mean, how do we get governments to start acting now?
You're right. So Shuli, you mentioned COP27 in Egypt. And it is going to be the COP of food. All of the groups, and I'm sure Gain, Jessica, I'm sure you're working with all the groups and the colleagues, because because Egypt, being in Africa, wants to lead. I know they are a natural leader for a focus on food. And when we link up the numbers that Mario showed on the emissions, which is what he and I worked together on the IPCC special report on land, basically the food system overall is responsible for 1/3 of greenhouse gas, of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, we cannot solve climate change unless we address food. So it's basically now, it's all laid out on the table. All the food groups are going, right, Jessica? Everybody is like, it's going to be the food COP. And that's what we have to, we just all have to make sure we get there. And ahead of time, you know what? It's not just being there. If you've ever been there, it's amazing. It's an amazing experience. But in order to really get something happening there, you have to work ahead of time, as I know Gain is doing. You have to be getting with the countries and the diplomats ahead of time. Before the Paris Agreement, those French diplomats went around the world, I think, for 2 years ahead of time. So you have to, we as a community have to decide what it is we want, what language. You see, there's a lot of hoopla, right, there with everyone being there, but it's really about what is the language that's going to be in the declaration from Sharm el-Sheikh? What are the monetary commitments that are going to be lined up ahead of time? It's deciding on those concrete actions. That's what we have to do. And we as a community, and I also really believe, everything now is partnerships of partnerships, right? The partnerships of partnerships. So one thing that I really feel is we need to bring the nutrition community and the climate change community, as this podcast is, and this interview Cruncher is doing, but we have to make it real. Yeah. That we bring those groups together, because then we have the power of the partnership of the partnerships.
And this is exactly what groups like GAIN is trying to do. So Jessica, as we were saying, behind the hoopla, advocacy is going to be such an important tool in trying to change habits, trying to change policies, and trying to get policymakers on side. With things like COP27 coming up, what are your hopes for that?
Yeah, so I think I share the optimism that has been expressed so far, but perhaps with some reservations on how you actually get this moving. And I think in the run up to COP27, I mean, Cynthia, you mentioned that we're working this, of course, and actually this weekend I was in Cairo for an initial consultation about what some of the food activities might be at COP27. And I think there's two things organizations like GAIN really have to do. I think one is emphasizing that narrative, that urgency. Why do we care about this? What is going to happen? And creating that sense that we have to do something, because as Mario is saying, that's when the policy and the finance action really follows. And I think organizing events like this, and I'm glad that GAIN could convene this conversation, because I think it really demonstrates exactly why nutrition is so important in climate change. And then I think the second is much more challenging, and that's around what I would call translation. So translation from these kind of big, complex systems that we're trying to understand, that there's lots of research into, these packages of actions, things that are very context specific, into something that you can invest in, that you can take your nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement and say, look, this is something we're committing to. And I think that that's the other challenge with food and nutrition. I think it's partly around people haven't felt the urgency yet, but I think a big part is that complexity. And I think a role for GAIN and other NGOs is taking that middle ground, somewhere between the science, somewhere between the businesses, somewhere between what's going on the ground, and trying to express that and say, look, this is what we really need to see from finance, from business, from governments at an event like COP27.
Mario, you wanted to add to that?
Yes, which on just on what Jessica said, just to take it a step further, and that needs to create an accountability framework. It's beyond advocacy now. It's really holding accountable to emitters, to every business trying to do what they can. And for this, we need metrics. For this, we need protocols. For this, we need a series of incentives. But I think that we've been trying to do advocacy for the last 20 years. I remember, what was it, the COP in Denmark, when I went, can't remember, which number it was. And we were
so many.
Wow, food is going to be the big thing on this one and everything. And look, now we're talking about that this might materialize in Egypt. But, now we need to start holding people responsible for their actions. I think it's essential, especially if money starts flowing on this. We cannot just keep with the business.
Well, the problem of, saying that we need to hold governments accountable is that a lot of governments feel that they can't take action or implement these policies because they don't have the resources to do so and to make those changes. So what kind of help do we need to give to low and middle income countries to make these changes possible?
Finance, climate finance needs to really be ramped up for things to really start materializing.
But there was money promised.
It's
there
very
was
easy
billions to promised at COP26, and I'm not sure. I think I'm right in saying that a lot of those pledges didn't materialize. I think in part because a lot was taken over by COVID, but there has to be commitment from richer governments as well to enable the developing countries to make these kind of changes.
Yes, absolutely. And here's where the repurposing of subsidies conversation needs to occur. There's a lot of money locked into some of the actions, and that could actually change. But also, ensuring that, say, things like the Green Climate Fund and others really become more operational and way more agile in the way that they release funds and so on. Because I know so many people have been having trouble accessing funds that in many cases are there.
I think we need success stories on the ground. I was talking to a colleague yesterday who said, how like at the Harvard Business School, they have these case studies, right? And everybody studies them, and everybody is coming from all over the world and they're studying them. And those people go back and they're the ones who are in their governments and really deciding. And so we need really viable, I'm looking to Mario, successful, sustainable livestock case studies.
Yeah.
Right. We need from the mixed small, and then on the, for example, that's like in countries like Brazil and Uruguay and Ireland, right? It's not just all developing, right? And New Zealand, right? And New Zealand has done a lot of work on this, for example, too. But we also need them then for smallholder farmers. In Africa, of course, each one of those, for those those farming systems that can be scaled up, then we need them for the commercial farmers. And if we have these truly, totally worked out at scale, proving, and as Mario said, with the metrics, that's what we actually need. Because, investors don't like to invest in something that's just throwing money away with something that's a lot of talk, right?
So is there enough research and information? Do we have enough data to be able to hand over and say, look at this, these are the results?
I think so. I do. I certainly from AgMIP we have, and we're working on. Oh, and I have one more point at the end too. But Mario, what do you think? I think from AgMIP side, yes. From you're more in the livestock world. Are there some viable, really dynamite case studies that?
Yeah, there's some pilots, some pilots, and yeah, the pilot never fails, but the pilot never scales. Some people say. So we need to really make sure that
right.
Some of the options are really scalable.
Yeah,
I think that
which
partly,
that
you
we have
know,
to add that criteria in. You see,
absolutely.
that was never really a criterion in the studies, in the pilots previously, but now that scale up has to be part of it.
Yeah, but
I
certainly
want to
there are
make-
examples out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to make one more comment, which I think is very germane to the food system, which is that we need to we need to not silo mitigation and adaptation. So AGMIP has a program called Mitigation and Adaptation Co-Benefits. And we are creating protocols. Our pilot study is being done in Bangladesh right now. We're developing the models. So the models that have the emissions side in it with the interventions, as well as the climate change scenarios. And I totally agree with the development pathways, the dietary pathways, these scenarios that we need to upgrade the scenarios that are used in these kinds of studies. Absolutely. But, you know, as you know, as GAIN is working on its climate change, bringing climate change into its really fantastic nutrition programs, having it be both mitigation and adaptation, because this is the reality. It's, as I started out by saying, climate change is happening already. We all know that, but it really and truly is in all these agricultural regions. At the same time as we need to, every region, every part has to be doing its part on mitigation as well.
So look, I want to wind up the discussion by asking both of our scientists, what do you think are the single biggest actions that we need to see, or the single biggest commitments that we need to see from governments and policymakers? And let me start with you, Mario. What would make a massive difference?
Well, a massive difference to take a land-based approach, you know, and really, really think of actions to really stop land use change would be one of the biggest things that you could do. But in reality, I believe that, you know, everything within its context, and my biggest message would be that there's no real silver bullets, but what we need is really the agility to be able to combine and mix and match adaptation and mitigation options to solve the problems.
Thank you, Mario. And Cynthia, what would your big actions be?
My big action is include funds for research in every single project. This dovetails with what Mario said. We have to be agile. We have to be flexible. We have to be able to learn what works. There's too many projects there's like this normal metrics of evaluation of the project. No, it has to have researchers embedded into the projects, and with the researchers studying how to scale up, what the finance will be, how to communicate with the national stakeholders, and how to do the transboundary aspects. So this all has to be addressed at the same time. You know, just a thumbnail of those projects, right? You're right, like a thumb. Let's put a thumb of the research of the funds for learning, and because we all have to learn how to learn and be flexible so that we can solve it fast enough.
Brilliant, Cynthia, thank you so much. And Jessica, I mean, obviously from what we've been hearing, it's great to hear the optimism, the enthusiasm, and this is clearly going to help make a difference, but it's also clear we have to take decisive action and act now. What is GAIN's message on what we can do to respond to climate change on nutrition and food security?
Yeah, so I think there are two things I'm taking away from this conversation. The first is the science is loud and clear. I mean, climate change is and will have serious effects on nutrition, whether that's through the adverse events, the floods, the droughts, the temperature changes, the reduction in yields, the reduction in quality of our food. You know, this is a really serious threat to nutrition. And I think there needs to be a greater recognition of that across the board. And I think the second, and to bring back some of that tone of optimism, is that, you know, really what we need is integrated action. It's not two separate agendas, climate and nutrition. It's one integrated agenda where we need to see sustainable development that meets both climate and nutrition goals. And I think we've heard, about how nutrition organizations can respond, how the climate community can think about how to incorporate nutrition into their work in mitigation and adaptation. And it goes beyond that, as we discussed. It's about governments, businesses, financial institutions, all taking this integrated approach where we need to see both action on climate and nutrition together. And I hope that everyone listening can reflect on that and perhaps try and bring that into their work, whatever it is that you do in relation to food.
Jessica, thank you. Yeah, I think it's really clear that climate change and nutrition are inextricably linked. And I want to say a big thank you to all of my guests for laying out the evidence, the science so comprehensively, and also looking at pathways about what we can do to mitigate some of those and adapt to some of those changes which are coming. Cynthia Rosenspike, thank you. Mario Herrero and Jessica Colston. And if you want to find out more about the work that GAIN is doing, latest news and events and a replay of this, then just go to the website gainhealth.org. And you can also follow us on Twitter. We're at GAIN Alliance. Thank you very much, and I hope you join us again next time.